Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. 1 second, I'm hearing myself. Thanks for joining us for this session, online and in presence. We hope that a few people will keep trickling in. It's Friday morning for everyone. Welcome to this panel, which is a panel organized by GDN. So it's nice to have a GDN panel at the GDN conference, so we will make the most of it. Of course, the panel is titled Taxation, Fiscal Policy and Development, Local Evidence Ecosystems. We have a group on this panel. Sorry, let me introduce myself first. So I'm Francesco Obino, and I'm Director of Research and Programs at the Global Development Network, and by no means an expert in taxation or fiscal policy, but we'll get to that. We have a panel of excellent speakers who are actually working on fiscal incidents and the link between fiscal policies and equity specifically. And as opposed to other panels where we actually discussed the content of policies and options and evidence, this panel is slightly different because we're going to discuss not so much the topic itself, but the process of generating evidence on these topics. Of course, as we know, we do research and we produce evidence because we want it to be discussed and used, right? So whether we are right or wrong, whether the analysis is rigorous or less rigorous, has actually, as we know, very little influence on whether it is discussed and used by those people who have a role, have a word to say on the topic. So today we're going to discuss how we can go about generating evidence on these topics in ways that make it easier for people to pick up the content of the research and, of course, to use it. Again, generating evidence in itself is obviously not enough. We need to understand what kind of evidence we're generating, how it circulates, who reads it, who has access to it, who understands it, why they access it, and of course how it is used and why. Right? People can have very many different motives and visions that bring them to use existing evidence, often even in contrast with the objectives of those people who generated that evidence. And of course, we have also representatives from international agencies who support this kind of evidence generation work at the local level, and we're going to basically share and discuss quite openly the experiences we each have in trying to make sure that the evidence we are helping to generate is actually relevant and discussed locally. I'm not going to read everybody's bio because you have them on the microsite and of course on the conference material. But in fact, I would like for the speakers to introduce themselves, yeah, and just introduce themselves through the work that they do, yeah. I'd like to start with a question, which is the following. I'm gonna, your work, yeah, the work of each one of us aspires to increase equity of fiscal policies at the country level. Right? And we aspire to do that by providing evidence and analysis that can inform those decisions to increase equity through fiscal policies. But how do you actually do it? Yeah? Can you give us an example of how you do this and where you do it? Which specific national context? I'd like to turn to the panel, and starting with Dimitrij Konsewitch, who's, of course, tax advisors at GIZ. Thank you, Dimitrij.
Thanks a lot, Francesco. Great to be here and to discuss today the topic of how to generate evidence and then also how to use it, how to translate it. I currently work with GIZ in Bonn at headquarters as a policy advisor on a sector program for good financial governance. Thus, on the one hand, advising BMZ, the German Development Ministry, on all topics relating to international tax policy. But then, on the other hand, also taking a bird's eye perspective and working and advising, helping, serving as a backstopper for taxation programs, projects all across the world that GIZ is implementing in their good financial governance portfolio. So when I was firstly approached to speak on this panel, I felt humbled and irritated a little bit because in contrast to literally all the other speakers so far on this conference, I'm neither a researcher nor a policymaker. I see my role more as a facilitator and translator of research evidence. And in this angle role, so like be neither nor, but trying to use and translate economic analysis and legal comparisons, sometimes literally taking English economics papers or legal analysis and translating them into understandable German that is then being used within the ministry to position themselves, but also research that is being written by research institutions as represented during the conference in the last days and providing this evidence for our projects all across the world. So exactly, and as such, I actually realized at some point I actually worked with all the with all the other panelists, either directly or indirectly. So with Maya, Maynor, and Francesco on the equity budgeting tool, which they will talk about, which GIZ just recently rolled out in Namibia, Ghana, and Guatemala. With Mehdi in Pakistan working with subnational taxation, and with Anda as well indirectly through our colleagues on inequality. So having said all this, using research and evidence made, the local context matters. The local context matters to actually put it to use. And that's where GIZ relies on its long-term advisors in country to achieve a successful technical cooperation in order to use the research that is being produced in order to facilitate to use the trust with the partners that we have in country. So and then but that's so far from my side.
And of course, GIZ works at the country level with in-country presence in offices and teams. And let me turn to Mehdi, who's actually Mehdi Rizvi, who's actually connecting from Nepal today, from the GIZ team in Nepal. Mehdi, do you want to take the floor? What do you actually do and how you do it?
Yes, thank you very much, Francesco. Good afternoon from Kathmandu in Nepal. Good morning in France. So as you mentioned, I am currently heading the GIZ Implemented Revenue Administration Support Project in Nepal, which is funded by the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. The project works with the National Tax Administration, or the Inland Revenue Department, as it's called, on optimizing the performance of the tax administration and making it not just a tax collector, but a genuine contributor to national economic development through formulation of economic policies, while at the same time facilitating the taxpayers in discharging their responsibilities. Coming to your question, I think as a development partner, we are working in the country. We consider it a very important part of our responsibility and our function. I'll probably allude to that in a little bit more detail later as to why that is necessary. But we consider it a very important part of our function to support the government administration or our counterpart government department through research and through provision of information which can lead them to make more informed decisions. And there are several cases as to how this has happened. But if I were to, because you mentioned about how we actually do it, I would say that one of the things that we've realized, I mean, I've worked in 3 countries in South Asia, and my experience of working with the government is that research in the government is, the first initial response is always, it's met with some skepticism. It's not always readily accepted at face value, and that is what I've observed. And therefore, what we have found to be, generally speaking, I wouldn't say 100%, but 75 to 80% of the time, I would say it's proved to be a very successful practice, is that when we have this kind of a research on important aspects of fiscal policy, we tend to involve the relevant partner ministry or the government department in the actual evidence collection process itself, so that they can actually, I mean, of course, they're not collecting all the evidence, but they are part of the process so that they can fully understand and also be satisfied with the fact that the information that they are going to get at the end of the study has been, the data for that study has been collected in a fair, scientific manner, and that they do not have any inhibitions about adopting the findings of such a practice. And maybe if I could just complete with a small example of similar practice that we did, and that is with the pricing of petrol. So we, right now, the whole global economy is facing this challenge with high oil prices around the world due to the international situation. And there was this question that whether the government should increase the oil prices completely or should it be providing subsidy. And the general temptation was that there should be subsidy because the bigger number of users of petrol are those who have two-wheelers, and the assumption is that the people who are who have cars are relatively well off. They represent the upper middle class and the upper class over here, especially in this country, because of the pricing structure as well. So the two-wheelers are the ones who represent the middle class and the lower middle class, and therefore the assumption was that because they are the main users, so therefore a subsidy is definitely required. Now, this assumption was, of course, not based on a wild guess. It was based on a certain statistic that the number of two-wheelers registered in the country is more than twice the number of registered cars. So we actually did a research where we collected data from petrol pumps around the country, several dozen of them, on the sales of petrol. And at the end of a 1 month period, we realized that in terms of volume, almost 70% of the petrol sales were going to the cars. Only 30% were going to the two-wheelers. So this was an important finding for the policymakers because it was counterintuitive to what they were initially thinking. And then that led to them coming up with other measures which could lead to more focused, targeted subsidies and benefits towards that segment of the consumers. So, but I would again just like to close that by saying that the acceptance of that evidence by the government was because of the fact that the government department, which is responsible for the taxation, was directly involved in gathering of this evidence. And therefore, they could actually see that this figure is not somehow academically or statistically maneuvered in such a way that to derive a result, they could actually see the data being generated in real time. So that's just something for your interest. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mehdi. And we're already entering the discussion, really, very nicely. Under David, of course, with the French Development Agency, AFD, you've seen on many panels. Thank you for joining us today, too.
Thank you, and I hope you're not bored of me being all over the panels.
Absolutely.
But very briefly, so as I did mention in some of the other discussions, I'm a senior researcher with IFD, and the unique position of a research department within IFD compared to maybe others is that we both provide insights for the policy dialogue with our partner countries, but also provide support and evidence to our colleagues, and we try to support research and which could feed into the international debates. So what we are seeing more and more is that there is need for support at all of these levels. We're very lucky to be able to work with our European partners, with the European Union, but also with GIZ, with Enable, with IACID, on inequalities. And again, what we saw is that in order to be able to be credible, to be legitimate, and to be able to propose something of use to the partner countries, we need tools. Among these tools, we have a large array. The fiscal incidence analysis is one of them. The types of micro-simulation tax benefit analysis are others. But what the countries need are these tools. And in order for these tools to be used and to be recognized, they both need to be sound from an academic point of view and to have a local ownership. So I did mention the issue of ownership, but I don't think we can stress it enough. Because what we are saying is that if we support tools which are too complicated or for which there's no local capacity to be able to use it, those tools are useless. So one of the things is that what we are trying to do within IFD is to promote tools that can help us in increasing the equity of the policies that are being thought of by the government and which can be used locally. And as we all know, there's this issue of data in most of the countries where we work. So these tools need also to be sensitive to this type of issues. What we did, so I did mention the example of Morocco in one of the panels where we worked with the Moroccan government, and this is where I think for us at IFD it was quite enlightening to see how if we work with an international partner such as the CQ, who works with the Department of Fiscal Affairs in Morocco and trains them on the model, then they can just use the model on their own. It was a big success. But we have other examples. A couple of weeks ago, we had a training in Colombia with Maynor for the Colombian Ministry of Finance and of Planning, where we've developed a version of the fiscal incidence analysis, much more, it's not a very difficult tool, but we're together with Fedesaro, we developed an even lighter version where they have an Excel file that they can use, and they did the training, and they are currently using it in order to simulate the potential impacts of the policy reform, which is currently going on Colombia. And maybe one last point, which I think is quite important, is that within international institutions, we also need to raise awareness around the equity impact that the projects and the policies that we support could have. So again, there is also this need of both maybe creating a little bit of in-house capacity, but especially creating in-house awareness that when we support a policy, we need to think about what its impact could be in terms of equity. Most of the times, of course, we think about financial impact, etc., but we need to think beyond that and think in social terms. Thank you.
Many thanks, Anda. Again, we're really kind of going right to the core of the topic with just also remembering that the issue of link between evidence and its understanding and its use is not just for governments locally, but for agencies within as well, and of course at multiple levels. I'd like to now invite Maya Goldman, who's among other things also a fellow at GDN, to take the floor. Maya, can you talk a little bit about your work and how you do it?
Yeah. Hi, everyone. So I'm a freelance, do consulting and research work for different organizations. So I do a couple of different things around inequality evidence. So firstly, I produce models of fiscal systems, so of the sort that Ander was just talking about, the fiscal incidence models, which analyze different taxes and transfers within a country and how each of those impact on poverty and inequality, and also simulate possible policy changes. I also do training of others to do the modeling. And as Francesco mentioned, most recently, what's quite different and new for me is I've been working with GDN to think a little bit about ways in which we can map and understand the research system that we're coming into in order to ensure that there is research uptake of the evidence that we produce. And the last way is just coming in and simulating policy changes. And maybe I'll use this as an example. So off the back of some work which actually Ander worked on and funded and began a number of years ago, which I think has been really successful and had a lot of offshoots. Most recently, we've been doing some simulations for the National Treasury and for the Presidency around what to do with a new grant that was implemented during the pandemic, and what should happen to it as the pandemic eases slightly, and what should happen to it in the medium term and the long term, and how we might be able to finance something like that. I think it's really beneficial to be able to have a model. It takes a long time to build a whole fiscal incidence model. And so to have that ready for a time at which there's a kind of an urgent set of simulations which are needed for the medium-term budget, to be able to just jump in and use that model and produce results, I think is really useful. And I think it's one of the key things around this is timing. If you can't get the results ready in time for the medium-term budget, they're not going to be used. So flexibility and timing is really helpful in that situation.
Thank you, Maya. And of course, last but not least, Maynor Cabrera, who also in part works with GDN, but of course also with the commitment to Equity Institute. Maynor, can you tell us a bit more about your work and what you do?
Thank you, and good morning. I'm maybe different than the rest of the panelists because I work now as a consultant, but I have a time, maybe a more exciting time than now, when I'm working in different think tanks in Guatemala. And it's interesting that this work requires not only to have good quality analysis, but to communicate this analysis, to at least to try to make some advocacy for some policies. And now what I am doing is collaborating with mostly with international agencies that are a channel to work with the governments, also with some think tanks in my country. And also I have the opportunity to work at CQ Institute, that I'm associated still with the work at CQ Institute, and help to help to refine this tool that always is improving, and to use this tool in different contexts, and to try, for example, to find evidence from different countries to compare, and it's very interesting this kind of analysis. But of course there is a big challenge for the think tanks and for the international donors to communicate the results to different public. This is a part of what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to, for example, to explain the methodology when I do this type of analysis. But the real importance of what you do is with all the partnerships that you can do with all the network you can do, because as a consultant, you are only a part of a team. You are a part of a team, and you can connect with different groups and have at least have an impact of your job, not only in terms of maybe creating knowledge or analysis, but also in terms of trying to make some contributions to the actual policy, to the actual governments where you work, and also to the NGOs that maybe we will talk later about this, but they are good because they collect some information from the think tanks and make the think tank, the NGO and the media make this information more easy to digest for the general public. So this is most of the role that I'm doing now as a consultant with different partners, of course, GDN and GIZ, and IFD. So the important thing here is to have this partnership with different, because a consultant is the most important what you can do to be part of a thing and give your part. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Maynor. And I really like the mix of experiences we have here on the panel, because we have, of course, people who work with international agencies at the international level, with international agencies at the national level. We have people who have experience working with national institutions, government institutions, but also experience with working with think tanks and NGOs. So I think before we go, and we know that who does the research obviously matter. It matters to what will happen to that evidence. But before we go into discussing who does what and how they do it differently, I just wanted for a second for us to think about the research and evidence generation process itself, right? Because, of course, we talked about the importance of having tools, right? And by that, I think we mean almost universal tools, yeah? Tools that can be applied across different countries, right? And of course, we're talking about analysis, but I think there are a lot of opportunities within a research project to shape the kind of demand that might be for specific evidence we're trying to generate. So there are things we can do, obviously, before, on the side, and after of the research project to make it more relevant, to grow a demand for it, but there are also things that we can do within the research project itself, the way we design the research projects. So now I'd like to ask the panelists to comment on this, yeah, and to point out to one thing that you think we never think enough about when generating evidence, yeah? Given the objective we have of course, generating policy relevant evidence and evidence that will be used. What is the thing during the research process, before or after, or on the side, that we don't think enough about? And in fact, I'll propose to go in reverse order. So, Maynor, if you want to keep going, thank you.
Okay. I again think about a lot of things, but maybe one thing that is important, maybe I have expressed something about this, and you know that is important, but we never take care about the communication. Maybe you make a lot of efforts trying to be good at their methodology, and maybe sometimes you achieve being good at methodology, but to communicate results to a wider public is something that, even that you make the efforts, is always a challenge, and you will never take it for granted. But another thing is that also you have to consider the political moment that you are living. There is some opportunities and some specific moment. For example, in Guatemala, there was a tax reform in 2013, and at that moment, a community of think tanks, They're named G40 because we are 40 economists supporting a tax reform. At that moment, it worked very fine. All of us were very enthusiastic in this tax reform. But for example, the times change. And the time now is changing, especially in countries like Central American countries, when we have some kind of, I don't know how to say it, a less democratic wave. We have a less democratic wave in Central America. So in the past, we have, as a think tanks, more space to share our ideas. But now the windows is closing. The windows is closing now. We have, for example, governments like Nicaragua that they are expelling a lot of think tanks from their country. And the bad thing is, for example, in countries like Guatemala and El Salvador, they are copying some laws from this country. And we have fear, for example, as a researcher community, that this we could be this country in the future. But because we are at least in Guatemala, when we have authoritarian military regimes in Central America, in Guatemala we have authoritarian military regimes. When everyone returns to democracy, we return to democracy. But now we have a very authoritarian way that limits the space to interact as a think tanks, NGOs, and maybe also to international community. They have to be more cautious to give advice to the government. In the past, for example, in my country, there was peace accords, and you see in each page of the newspaper the representative of United Nations, World Bank saying the government must do this. Now, you don't see it. You don't see it. The times change, so this is important to communicate for thinking about the time you're living. So you have different challenges, and sometimes you have different opportunities.
Thank you, Maynor. A very interesting point, and I'm afraid you're not alone in having more and more authoritarian governments. So maybe that's something we can learn from your experience. The second interesting thing you said, which I found very interesting, is that this opportunity window, and not just in terms of being ready. Often we talk about just readiness and timeliness, etc. But I think what you're suggesting also is patience, right? Like sometimes we just need patience. We have to wait it out till there is something, there's an opportunity, there's a window of opportunity that opens up. Maya, what is the one thing we don't think enough about when doing research, specifically on fiscal incidents and the link between fiscal policies and development broadly?
I think one of the big challenges is around there being trust in the process. I think that we work within a system where everything needs to be planned, there are deliverables that are handed out, and that is how people measure success. But usually a successful process really requires things to be able to emerge organically. So I'm referring a little bit, Ander talked earlier about ownership. And I think ownership is lip service if you can't allow deadlines to change, if you can't allow the design to change, then you're not letting go of control of the project in any way. You're not allowing your partners to have any ownership. But I think there's a lot of fear, understandably so, to do that, because you are letting things slip out of your control in a way, and you have to be able to keep a handle on that and still allow things to come to a useful fruition. So I think allowing things to be a bit more emergent, building demand with policymakers at the beginning, allowing the project scope to change and for deadlines to change is really quite key to a project really being used at the end.
Could you give us an example maybe from your own experience where that flexibility made a huge difference? Yeah.
So I can give you an example also of where I think it didn't. So in the case of East Timor, the project was developed, and in a way there was a very good relationship between the international partner that I was working for and government. So government were very happy to go along with the project. But there wasn't genuine understanding of why it was useful at the beginning. And so the report has sat there for 8 years and never been published because it's never been a priority for government. They haven't understood why they should or how they can really use it. Whereas in the case of, for example, I mean, South Africa, as a South African based in Cape Town, this is my go-to example, and also because I think it's one of the best projects that we've done. I think that ANDA worked really well to build ownership with the South Africans, and I also think because of the power dynamic, because of the local researchers in South Africa being quite confident in themselves, they also demand what they expect, and they have good relationships with government as well. So there were a lot of things in the environment that were set up to allow things, but there was the flexibility from the side of the donor, which meant that things could move and could change and could go according to what government wanted, but also according to what the local researchers felt was important. And so the project went massively over deadlines, but I think it was one of the most successful projects I've ever worked on in terms of the fiscal incidence and research uptake. And as I said, it's still being used years after to produce simulations. So I think that's a really good success story.
Yeah, thank you about that. Yeah, it's true. I mean, this is true of a lot of debates in development more generally, this dissonance, this misalignment between timelines of projects, this idea of everything is a project. And what we of course know is a policy and the timelines and the cyclical political timeline of change at the national level. Anda, what is one aspect, again, of working with policy processes that we don't take enough into consideration when generating evidence?
So I like this formulation of the question better, that we don't take enough, rather they never, because I don't think that there's something that we never take. The countries are very different. And I think one of the, I'm just going to say two instead of one. And the first one is linked to this difference and also to what Maya just said. I think that, again, the local research capacity and the trust are the things that we don't take enough into account. Also because, so if we think about policy processes, and as Maya said, these are long. As international organizations or international consultants, we can't build trust in the long term. This is also why we need these local research capacities, and we need them to exist. And these local research capacities and the trust is very different between low-income countries and middle-income countries. And this is also what leads to a very different landscape of think tanks and link between researchers and policies. I mean, if we take the example that Maya just gave on South Africa, in South Africa we have excellent research capacities. I'm seeing Alejandra from CIEP, and CIEP is doing an amazing work in Mexico alongside many other think tanks. But the same cannot be said for smaller countries in West Africa, for instance. So that we should also focus on these priorities. And the other thing, which I think we don't take enough, but maybe again, I'm mistaken, are the general equilibrium effects of the policy evidence that we are often funding or doing. Because quite often, of course, policymakers, they think about one policy. So even though we propose different tools, very often, and in economics and in academia especially, we tend over the last years to leave a bit aside the general equilibrium effects.
Thank you. Very, very relevant, obviously. Let me go back to Mehdi. Mehdi, you work directly, yes, daily with, of course, government officials. You already mentioned a few things, I have to say, in the first intervention, but can you give us your comments on this question?
Yes, I mean it's a very interesting term that you used in your question, policy relevant evidence. By that, my understanding is that we're talking about the evidence which eventually influences the policy. And over here, I think, I would probably second Anna on what she said probably earlier, that it's not that we don't necessarily have areas which are never considered at all, but it's just that there are some areas which probably could be given more importance. And one of those areas that I think is the motivation of the policymakers. So there is the tendency of policy. Governments, generally speaking, tend to be inertia-driven, And in democracies, we have the opportunity through the elections to change that inertia whenever we have the elections. But in some of the autocratic forms of government, which one of our colleagues was also referring to in Central and South America, I mean, that inertia lasts a bit longer. And therefore, the policymakers tend to have some set or predetermined motivations which they like to continue with. And therefore, it's very important for any research to be consciously mindful of those motivations so that the research is then used for the purpose, or the findings are used for with the intention which these have been developed, and they don't become a subject where parts of the research is picked and chosen to derive conclusions that suit the continuation of that inertia, so that instead of leading to a positive change in the policy, they just become a means of adding to that continuation of that policy. So that's something that I think would be considered when designing these kinds of research. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Mehdi. Dimitrij.
Pretty hard to follow up on such excellent comments. What went right now through my mind is having patience and using the window of opportunity. So be it the small scale or the long term. So I just recently learned, for example, that in autumn, you can't do missions to most parts of African countries because they have mission bans. Their governments are busy with the budget season. So, and that's extremely important when designing research, when commissioning research, to then consider that interviews can't be done in the second half of the year. Policymakers and budget teams will be busy with their other work. So first half of the year it is. So that's like on a small scale, but like even more important, the big ones. So when governments are simply not ready to reform, or if there is due to a multitude of reasons, no chance to get policy advice through. It is still important to remain in country, to keep on doing the research for when the moment arrives. That research will be extremely valuable to put to use, and there it is extremely important for both international organizations and the research community to be ready to then roll out to upscale the capacities that even in more dire times, in slower periods and slow seasons, can then be utilized, be it in the budget cycle or in the political cycles.
Thank you, Ron. I think very interesting elements are coming up. Of course, we talked about the patience, all things which go beyond, in fact, what we usually discuss when we decide to do a project, right? The concept note for a such project usually doesn't include any of these things. So patience. We talked about the link between trust and flexibility. In fact, changing plans is critical to doing the research, right? It's critical to the plan. Yeah, the possibility, the clause that the plans might and will change. Of course, local research capacities, and we also talked quite a bit with Maynor about this for Central America. Also, the existence or even the survival of a research community is an issue. Inertia, and of course, taking into account the political and policy cycle, right? And making sure that you are there throughout it, yeah, like have a presence, yeah, so that you keep being a credible advisor. Now, as we talk about ecosystem, local evidence ecosystem, of course we talk about diversity of actors, and we started talking about those. Of course, Maynor mentioned think tanks. Anders' comments and also Dimitri's comments really point to the fact that international agencies are part of it, local ecosystems. But of course, we also mentioned that local ecosystems differ from each other in terms of the structure and nature, number of actors, the roles, etc. Now, I'd like to invite you to spend to share a few comments, yeah, on your experience in different countries, and what are maybe the actors that played a significant role in your work, and maybe where the role was a little bit counterintuitive or unexpected. What are the actors, in fact, that you think played a role? Who would like to start, in fact? And also Maya and Mehdi were online. Anda? Yes? Thank you.
I can start just very briefly. And maybe I would start with someone who does not play, or at least who's not being given enough of a role, which are the NGOs, with regards to the issues of equity and fiscal matters. We in Europe and in France, we see, for instance, Oxfam playing a huge role in the discussions around this. In some of our partner countries, they still play a role, again, South Africa, but Mexico quite a lot, but not many others. And in many of the countries where we work, NGOs, through the role that they should play in these equity issues, I don't think that they're present enough, and they don't link enough with researchers. But from the first I said, no, not every organization should play the same role, and this is the idea that we should share and identify where we each have a value added, which very often it's not the same.
Great. And when you say that NGOs could play a much larger role, do you see that role being on the production side, which is obviously the evidence production side, which is obviously the default thing, or more on the diffusion, discussion, debate, or on the, in fact, as users of it evidence?
All of them. As users of the analysis, on the link with the researchers, in terms also of lobbying and of analyzing the results or what's being pushed by the government. We do talk a lot about the issue of accountability, and we know that there's a strong need for accountability in most of the low and middle income countries, as well as our countries. And when we talk about accountability and transparency, this is where I think NGOs should be very present, and they have a role to play in mobilizing everyone to look at those accounts. Again, there are extremely interesting examples, I think, in Ghana around that. But we could do, and even as international donors, we could support them to do more.
Thank you. Dimitrij?
While you were speaking, I had to think of Timor-Leste, where Maya and I were both ODI fellows at the same time and working in the Ministry of Finance there. And there was a local NGO which played an extremely important role to comment and on the fiscal policy of the government, and even for us in the ministries was extremely important to have at least one very capable NGO that provided the role of civil society and of national civil society, not only the international NGOs. They do have a role, but theirs is often Western biased and reflecting the discussions, the problems that societies of the global north have, in contrast to the societies in the global south with very particular and localized discussions and contexts. For the further role of actors, it's I think it's extremely useful, just like as local NGOs, international NGOs, then each donor, international organization plays a different role, and for national actors to utilize the multitude of players. So when I was in Timor-Leste, I was first a little bit confused about the different fiscal years different donors had. So the Japanese were running on a different fiscal year than the American-based organizations, then the continental Europeans, then the Australians. But while working with their reports and looking into their grants, I realized it's actually, it evens out throughout the year, because like there's no big donor, at least in that context, which demanded reports at the same time, which then also would, like in the larger scale, leads up that different organizations, different donors have different cycles, which can then be utilized by the national actors for the work, the technical assistance, the research that they require, that they want to be financed. So like if the Germans are not ready to finance it, let's go to the French, who right now don't have an election cycle. So like just like to give one random example. So there's a strength and a chance in diversity, in complexity, and yeah.
And on both sides, right? Also the donors have their own differences and different timelines and priorities and agendas, of course. But I like already the contrast, no? Seeing NGOs as a potential kind of ally almost, or then seeing NGOs as a sector which has been captured, in fact, maybe by international donors. Where you know, how to... So maybe it just means that NGOs will play different roles in different countries, right? So like there's no one-size-fits-all model. Mehdi, do you want to come in on this topic? You work, you know, daily again with government, but what are the partners locally that you think are most, not useful, but most valuable to your work? Beyond the usual suspects of government officials one side and technical assistant agencies on the other.
Yeah, I mean, what I personally feel is that for any kind of research, the academia is obviously a linchpin. The academia is going to play a very important central role in any kind of research. Sometimes they're at the front, sometimes they're in a backstopping role, whether the research is being done by the development partner, by the NGO, and the academia, or even by the government in some cases. I mean, there's maybe a public sector university that may be providing the technical assistance for that. So the academia obviously has a very, very central, in fact, pivotal role in any kind of research. But in terms of who takes the lead on that research, that is where there's a lot of variation. And we already had this discussion about the different roles of NGOs. And in that, maybe I could also add the aspect that one of the determining factors is also the space that is provided to the NGOs, because that is also an issue in many countries, that there are certain limitations to the operations of non-governmental organizations in various countries. There are limits to what they can do. There are some countries where it's not possible to do any kind of research survey without getting a proper no objection certificate from the government, which is generally a theoretical process. Practically, the NOC never arrives. So it's also a case of who has the more space to operate in a certain area. So it could vary between the NGO and the academia. But like I said, academia is at the heart of it.
Thank you for that. I have a question here, because in a way we often refer to kind of this kind of efforts that, you know, we're talking about, maybe are funded by FD or GIZ or others, as if they kind of exist in a little bit in a void, yeah? And I think it's interesting in a void of knowledge, yeah, or evidence, yeah? It would be interesting to know from you, when you mentioned, of course, local academia, but to what extent kind of the work you do relates to research agendas that are those of local academics, you know, local economists or fiscal policy experts in Nepal that are thinking about these issues from their own perspective. How much of that do you see in your work?
We do see a lot of collaboration taking place, although I would just like to qualify that by saying that that collaboration is to some extent constrained by the scope of the projects that we implement. So there may be, for example, if I'm implementing a project dealing with tax issues, there may be a very, very good research proposal coming related to the agriculture sector or renewable energy sector. But that's something that I would not be able to support no matter how much I like it, because it's beyond the scope of my project. So to the extent that there's a fit, there's a match, we certainly do work with the local academia, and I would say, favorably look at good proposals, research proposals coming from their side.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. By the way, I would like to open to the floor. I mean, if anybody has at any point a comment, a question, just feel free. We'll get you a mic. Oh, perfect. Sorry, Maya and Maynor, we'll get to you. Sorry?
First tips on the answers.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I was waiting for this space for the last 3 years. My name is Alejandra Macias. I'm from Mexico. I'm a director of a think tank that research on public finances. And it's been very interesting what you've been talking about. And I would like to comment that it's true that we have to be patient. We have to find this moment to be able to do things with the government. But we also have to be creative and innovative to find another ways to reach the people you want to reach. That's one point. And the other about what we don't pay a lot of attention when you want to communicate is the audiences. It's what you want to say, but who you want to listen. And it's not just government, but it's also everybody. But when you say, I want to communicate to everybody, it's like you say nothing. So what we do is that we have 3 audiences. One is policymakers, the other is future policymakers, and the other one is society. And we translate, but we all are researchers, but we all are also communicators. So we are academia. I have 5 PhD in my team. And so we are very academic, but we also have to think about the main 2 messages that we have, that we want to people to stick with. So this is some of the tools that we generate in our NGO, like every day. So I would think that it has to be together, like research with communication.
Yeah, so building up the question of capacity. Well, research capacity is not just about answering questions, but making sure that people are interested in your questions and being able to communicate it. Please, and also Linda after. Yes, Abdul.
Yeah, I'm Abdul Chaudhary from the South Center. I had a comment about the importance of demand-led research and asking policymakers in developing countries what they actually want and what they think the gaps are, and the need to identify a consumer of the product sort of at the beginning of the process, and how critical that is to actually result in an impact. And our work at the South Center focuses on supporting standard setting negotiations, so it's not really like a local context per se. And I just wanted to share some experiences that we had. The new membership of the UN Tax Committee, when they took over, we asked them, what do you want to raise? And they raised issues such as taxation of royalties, software payments such as royalties, taxation of international shipping. And we found that there was really no research on this. I mean, there was one paper by the International Center for Tax and Development on shipping, but on software royalties, there was really nothing. And this really sort of drove in the fact of how little the research which is out there is really consultative in that sense. And I think that is something which should really go into driving the research agenda, consulting firsthand. Another thing which we found really helpful is the importance of revenue assessments. For example, in the 2-pillar solution, there have been no country-level revenue assessments, and this is something developing countries are really, really concerned about. How much money are we going to get if we go ahead with this so we can make a good decision? And at the South Center, we have come out with the world's first set of country-level revenue estimates from Amount A and Article 12B as well. And this is something which is an agenda which I would really reiterate is something which should be carried forward, especially by the community over here, because these rules are still being finalized for Amount A at least, and countries really need this data. And similarly, I would say that even if we look at international shipping, one of the topics is on how much revenue has been lost because of the inability to tax these shipping companies. So these revenue assessments, I would say, is another issue which is of really great interest for policymakers from developing countries. So, yeah.
So I think you're talking, of course, demand-led, but also how to create coalitions that across different contexts that can focus on topics of common interest. So the network dimension. So of course that's very interesting. Networks as an actor in and across research ecosystems. Linda?
Thank you very much. Linda Zanfini from the French Agency for Development. A lot of very interesting have been just said. Just to add a small thing, you talked about democratic ownership of research, actually, and it is important, but we need to think about the two sides. On the supply side, we need to put the research in terms that can be understandable not only by policymakers but also by civil society, but also we need to reinforce, to strengthen the capacity of the civil society to use the research in the debate, in the public debate. And when we talk about the civil society, it's not just the NGOs, it's not just the think tanks, but depending on the countries, we have lots of local stakeholders that could add something important to the debate. It can be the local communities, and don't forget that in a few countries, for example, the trade unions are a real game changer. So don't forget about it.
Of course. People.
Yeah. One very minor point about North-South, Global South debate. I can narrate a very personal experience. I am one of the members of the University Accreditation Council in Bangladesh, and one of the issues we had to deal with is to standardize transcripts by all the 100 over private universities. And they were set to hire an international consultant for that. And I argued that this is a job we can do as members, we can do it. I'll take like a month to do it. But then we hire an international consultant simply to give a stamp of legitimacy. Because our stakeholders are the university vice chancellors. They won't listen to us. But if you get an international consultant, they will accept it. So we have to play diplomatically. And that diplomacy also applies to academic institutions and think tanks. I've seen from my personal experience, the leading think tank in Bangladesh, Center for Policy Dialogue, was very much acceptable to the government because they come up with excellent ideas. But once some of the leaders of the institute go on media criticizing the government, and next day they publish an excellent report, the government simply throws it down. They say, no, these are our critiques. We are not going to listen to them. So the maneuverability, the diplomacy, all those factors are very important for academics to take into account, that what is the environment they're working at and what are the policies that would be acceptable under what conditions. I mean, all these factors are extremely important. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And we will hopefully we'll have time to get into what the question about legitimacy and the international stamp, yeah? I mean, obviously you know very well, the work that GDN does is in fact to give that stamp to local researchers. So we will get to that unique added value that international actors can bring. So there's Pierre and one question here, yeah?
Thanks, Pierre Jacquet from GDN. I'd like to go back to these comments and debates on demand and ownership. And I am personally very much in favor of demand-led approaches, but I think we shouldn't fool ourselves. I mean, demand and supply are intellectual categories, and most of the time, demand in developing countries is supply-led. So I think one of the challenges we have is to help countries build that demand. It doesn't pre-exist. So when we say demand-led, we tend to ignore the fact that there is a process before that of creating that demand. And if you ask policymakers what they want in terms of research, most of the time they won't know what to answer to you. It's a little bit like the IT guy in your company comes to you and tells you what are your needs, and you just don't know because you don't know what is feasible, right? So I think that I'd like to hear your view about how to sustain that process, to generate it, and to lead to an actual demand for research domestically, because that's what we want to reach.
Thank you, Pierre, and we'll definitely talk about that in a second when we go to Maya.
Okay.
Please.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm Armand Bouchouan from the University of Chang, Cameroon. You raised a very interesting issue, that is whether the research agenda of this institution match with the local realities. And I realized that specifically in Cameroon, we have a decentralization process. And I'm not really sure that this issue is taken into account in the research agenda of the institution, because nowadays in Cameroon, local public finance authorities plays a real role, a very interesting role. So this is just a way to see how, if it's possible to include decentralization, the way maybe local authorities can contribute in fiscal policies in the research agenda. And I'm very happy for the issues you raised out during the discussion, because I'm actually conducting doing research assessment project with the GDN, and this session is like a specific doing research issues in our context. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Armand. I think it's a good point to go back to Maya, but let me do a quick introduction. Last year, GDN and the CEQ Institute at Tulane University kind of entered an MOU, an agreement, a very close partnership, where from now onwards, basically, we will be focusing on implementing the CEQ assessment across different countries, and this is how we came to work, of course, with agencies like Anders and Dimitrij. But as we were mandated to implement this tool, very well recognized tool, across different countries, we started wondering, what do we do with the analysis that comes out of this? We have access to the data, do the analysis, but who's going to read that analysis? Who's asking for that analysis, etc. So we started thinking, what is it that we can do, to support this uptake and circulation of knowledge, if we don't understand at all the demand, because it was a demand that was coming obviously from international agencies. And we started playing with a small project that Maya is leading, which is about research in news, and a mapping of local evidence ecosystems. And I wonder, Maya, whether you want to say a few words about that, and what we're learning, basically. It's a pilot. What are we learning from that?
Yeah, thank you. And I think it's a nice follow-on from a lot of the really interesting comments we've had. I'm sad that we're not going to have more time because there's obviously a lot of expertise coming from everyone in the audience and lots of really interesting ideas that I'd love to feed into this project. But I think maybe to start off with the idea around creativity, because I think that's a nice way to begin, that Alejandro brought up. I think that so far we've done the pilot in 3 different countries, in Namibia, in Ghana, and in Guatemala. And I think it's been really interesting to see the large differences, and in particular in the relationship between academia and civil society in those different countries. And it's really highlighted for me and brought home how much creativity some of those think tanks and academia have to have in order to engage with government. And also, and I think that links into the point that was made around the stamp of legitimacy. You know, one of the researchers in Ghana said to me that the international organizations get access to the data that the local researchers don't get. But the relationship in Ghana seems to be much more collaborative between academia and government. Whereas in countries like, in other countries, it seems like the slightest amount of criticism, as the audience also mentioned, means that nothing's going to be listened to. And it makes me wonder what the role for international organizations can be around using their platform to support local researchers to be better heard, or to support that relationship to be less, to mediate that relationship so that it can be less conflictual and so that the two parties can understand each other better. And I think that also links to Abdul's point around, I thought was a really lovely point around consumers and identifying consumers, and how that can potentially build more trust over time between these different actors who have quite different goals. But if they can be more consultative, listen at the beginning to what it is that the other parties are looking for, then possibly there's a room to build much more trusting relationships and therefore be better heard. I think, yeah, and Pierre-Jacques's point about demand and ownership. How do we help countries to generate demand? I definitely know how we don't help countries to generate demand. Often we present results at the end of a project, and government will ask for simulations, and there'll be no time left to run the simulations that government has asked for. We present a couple of simulations, they're not the ones that are of interest, and there's no time to do the ones that are of interest. And I think there immediately you break trust, and you break the sense that who are you really there for? Who is your consumer? It's clearly not government, because if it was, then you would have made the time to generate the simulations that they need. So I think it's a crucial point about developing demand at the beginning, showing what's possible, and showing that you will generate the time and space to actually do what government is asking for, and not just what the people who are funding you are asking for. Yeah, that was quite a lot, but thanks.
Thanks. And of course, for this exercise, we're trying to map the local evidence ecosystem. So we're trying to generate kind of an evidence base on supply, demand, who are the actors in the ecosystem, why they're interested in, what they're interested in, and why they will be interested in this specific topic. It's also about not just about understanding who could produce evidence, but also understanding who could be using. If they understand the evidence that is generated. Maynor, Ander, did you want to come in? Maynor was involved in the process in Guatemala. I wonder, what is there anything you learned, in fact, from this kind of attempt to map the ecosystem that you want to share with us? Given you know the ecosystem very well yourself, you are completely in the ecosystem. Was that exercise useful in any way? Do you think it would be useful to actors that want to work in Guatemala?
Okay. Maybe two things. One, that definitely there has been better times for think tanks in Guatemala. All of them are trying to survive, by the way. There's a funding crisis of think tanks in Guatemala. I believe that they were better. No, they are worse than I think. But I also learned that there are still lots of opportunities for help the think tanks, to help the research. And yes, think tanks always will have something to give the society. And as I explained minutes ago, maybe now we don't have governments and want to hear much about what is happening, but what the think tanks doesn't have have when I work there is that they are not preparing the next generation of researchers. This is one that we don't have now. This is not that they don't have resources. They don't have a research assistant that then will go to study more, to do some research, to go to work to the government, etc. They don't have these people that is preparing for the next generation of researchers. This is This is a worry, but maybe it's an opportunity to invest more in capacity building of the new generations. We talk a lot about young people, but we only talk and people is very valuable to be the next generation of researchers. Another thing, maybe, sorry for only bringing bad news, but is the result of the study. Another thing is that the access to information is key. So talking about opportunities is not a problem. Supporting national statistics system is key to keep alive these think tanks. So tears are not having very good last time in terms of access, in terms of production of statistics, but the international community has been very insisting in supporting the National Institute of Statistics, and they have opened a door, and they doing more things, and this is very important for us small countries like Guatemala. That, for example, when I started to try to apply theory of poverty, we don't have information. We were like philosophers. We only talk about, but we don't use how Mehdi says, policy relevant evidence to inform the policymaker. We only talk what we believe that, and based on perception, we everything goes on their side. So this is that I learned of the research news.
Yeah, and I think, how to build the demand, which I was asking. Training the next generation, I think is an excellent way to build demand. So if there's any donor here in the room that would like to build the next generation of experts on fiscal policy with us, the GDN is ready.
I just want to react a bit on that, but also the next generation, it's very important. And maybe to add a bit of complexity to Pierre's point, even when there is demand, very often the demand, and a bit to the colleague's point, the demand cannot be met with local supply. If we think about issues linked to climate change or biodiversity, it's very difficult to find those capacity locally. So we need to find a very fragile trade-off between supporting local ecosystems in research and responding to a labor demand. So what we're trying to do is also trying to take a pragmatic approach. I won't say opportunistic in the good sense, but a pragmatic approach. And one of the examples that I have is what we are doing at IFD is building what we call the Memorandum of Strategic Dialogues, which is going to the government and asking them, what are your priorities in terms of research? And let's see how we can support you in meeting them. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, of course. But in order to be able to do that well, one needs to have a very clear understanding of the local research capacity. Because working with the local researchers, they could tell you which is the research agenda and how they can push it. And one thing that we need to keep in mind is that very often in any country, people in the government have been students of that renowned professor, and that people know each other in the government and in the academia. So building on these relations is very often quite productive in terms of generating demand and trying to understand which are the priorities, and it also means trying to bet on people, which is not always ideal, and trying to add into, again, I speak as a donor here, but adding and making sure that in our research contracts, we ask research centers to have female researchers, to have young researchers as well, should be important because it helps us build the next generations.
And next generation is both about supply and demand, right? So we'll be hiring world-class experts to train the next generation soon. In the meanwhile, Dimitrij, do you want to come in?
It's always tough to follow up after her because like so many thoughts to digest, and I'm like have to step to like 2 steps back because like I haven't already fully thought through your very valuable comments. The comments from the Abdul before you leave. So like I wanted to respond. So Anna and Abdul. So. to I now pick and choose from the multitude of very valuable comments that have been made from the audience. Thanks a lot for that. First to Aman. Yet again, reiterating the comments that have been made here on the panel on the multitude of actors. So I know we are here in France, and decentralization is not a thing you should talk about when in this country. There are other countries. Now yes? So actually, okay. Oh, oops. So there are actors who are very well versed with decades of experience supporting governments on decentralization projects, who don't mind not working with not only the national government, but going into the provincial capitals and to local towns, supporting local communities, local policy makers and researchers, and that's also the beauty for development partners to be able to pick and choose between bilateral and multilateral donors. Some who do have expertise in their own countries with decentralization processes. So that's on Cameroon, and then the international perspective. So the South Center, and there it is especially in the OECD G20 processes. I think it's at least behind closed doors, or in the German-speaking community, the OECD officials fully admit that the work that is being done, the policy agenda that Tax Justice Network is doing is extremely important for the OECD itself to firstly do their BEPS agenda, and now also Pillar 1 and 2. So that is extremely valuable feedback that is being provided to have civil society with the tax justice agenda to put it in the discourse on the one hand. On the other hand, also extremely useful to have organizations like the South Center providing these numbers, even if it's just back on the envelope calculations, and even if it's criticizable in the methodology, but there are now numbers that can be used to just estimate what these policy reforms might be result in, and your numbers are being circulated, even if it's just in black boxes of 1 and 2 pages in foreign languages, but we do circulate them within government, and they are being used. So there's definitely a role for national, international NGOs, research institutions to provide evidence, even if you don't even know that it's being used.
Great, thanks. We could, of course, close the session on time, but I don't think the organizers would agree. So we'll be happy. No, jokes apart. I'd like to open the last round of questions, because I think we touched upon a lot of interesting things, and the role of international actors and agencies keeps coming up. Yeah?
I'm just going to add one point, because there's something we didn't touch upon, which is the subnational level. Because we have talked a lot about the national level, but even if we talk about tax policy and tax revenue, well, we talk about decentralization of demand, but we also need to see subnational governments as purveyors of demand for research, etc. And I just felt that this is a point we hadn't touched maybe enough upon, and I wanted to make it.
Yeah, absolutely. And the idea of looking at the ecosystem is really to also look at the subnational level and understand, go back to a question of federalism, what paths, where should we be looking for? Yeah, where should we be working? Where are the people that we need to be in touch with? Okay, I wanted just to close the panel by asking every panelist to just tell us in really 2 minutes each, max, I mean, just your ideas. How do we make the most of the position, the unique position that international agencies, not just talking about donors, but international actors have to play in this discussion? Because of course, you know, international comes with a lot of access, a lot of visibility. How do we make the most of that? Yeah. Who would like to go first? Maybe I'm turning to colleagues who are connecting online. Mehdi, would you like to go first?
Yes, sure. So in short, I think I'll just pick up on the theme that's been just discussed about the supply and demand of the research. So in that context, we're talking about the financial sector. I just draw an analogy. I'd say we act as maybe we can act, the role of the international organizations is to act as the intermediaries of research. Because we have the government on one side to whom we are very closely connected. We have the consultants, the NGOs, the think tanks on the other side who are the knowledge providers. And we have the access where we can, we listen to what the government is actually thinking about, what they're planning, what their future requirements are. And we have the access to the technical pool where we can inform them that this is the area where there is now an interest. And if you provide, or if you can produce some valuable research, we can use our platform to take that to the policymakers, because in the government there is it was very rightly said that the research uptake is not always that high. There is always this assumption that when the decisions are being taken, there are some experienced set of people, bureaucrats, government officers who are sitting there who have 20, 30 years of experience, and there is this, they're perceived to have that wisdom already to make the right decision without necessarily having access to the research. So even without discounting for the bounded rationality factor, I think without that research, their decisions are not always spot on. So this is where we can connect, and that's where I see the role.
Excellent.
Thank you.
So, platform, convening power, let's use that as much as we can. It actually comes for free. Even Dimitrij, you wanted to come in?
Mm-hmm. So for the international role of, the role of international organizations and international advisors coming in, I find it extremely important to always remind myself, at least, to stay humble, listen carefully, and to have patience. So who are we to come in, stay in the most expensive hotels in the city, and then tell people how to run the country? So it's like, how would our own society react if things like these would happen? So therefore, being humble is of utmost importance.
Great, thank you. Maynor?
Keeping being a partner of the countries and understand what the countries need, be aware that, the government definitely is the priority, but also civil society needs some support, and the community of researchers are an important part of the civil society. Yes, in terms that the capacity building, the transfer of technology, just you can do a lot of things for the civil society.
Thank you. Maya, online, and then we'll finish with Wanda.
Thanks. Yeah, I think I would really echo everything that my fellow panelists have said thus far. I love Dimitrij's point about staying humble. I think it's so important. And I think the one thing that I would want to add is, I think, an understanding of both what you bring and what you don't bring. I think sometimes there can be a lack of what international organizations really bring is this comparative experience. And I think that brings this capacity for countries to imagine, as colleagues have already said today, imagine things being different to how they already are. And that's an amazing thing to be able to bring. They don't bring the depth. And so to know that they don't have that depth of context. And I think also what Anda said earlier about the importance of mapping the research system, who is there. Yeah.
Thank you, Maya. Anda.
So I think that the role that we should be playing is that of linking and supporting those that need support, and also trying to push in the international agendas equitable and progressive policies. I think the example of the SDG 10.4 that CEQ, World Bank, and Oxfam, with the support also of GIZ, have been pushing in terms of, adding the fiscal incidence type of tools and of thinking to the national agendas, that was something positive. So linking all these different ecosystems nationally and internationally is something that we could do more of. Thanks.
Thanks. And I'll just share my own ideas on this. Of course, obviously as GDN, I have to say I think capacity building is a gigantic thing that international actors can do, not in the sense of training an entire new generation, but in kind of kickstarting that process that can lead to training a new generation of people interested in these topics. So catalytic action, I think we're all talking a little bit about that, catalytic action that international donors can deliver. And just going back to the title of the session and this idea of ecosystem, I think it's very important that international donors, that we don't mistake, in fact, an instrumental use of this analysis of ecosystems, right? Because there's a way to, let's go beyond the project mold, right? Because there's a way to look at the ecosystem which is purely instrumental to developing a communication strategy for a single project. But in fact, if you think about capacity building, if you think about everything that has been said, taking the voice of linking people, the platform, bringing the voice of people to the international scene, I think it's clear that there are things that can just improve, yeah, or point the local evidence ecosystem in the right direction beyond single projects, and this is really where the multiplier effect of an international project lies. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to the audience. I think we beat every other panel at the conference in terms of the ratio between people who ask questions and people who attended. So I think more than half of our audience asked questions. I think it's a world record. So thanks again for being engaged, and enjoy the rest of the conference.